Hi book lovers, welcome back to my channel. I am very excited to do today's video because it's basically a throwback video and I get to talk about all of my favorite books from way back when up until now. I am going to share and talk about my favorite books, my top favorite books that were published in each year of my life. So starting from 1996 to 2023. Now normally when people do this kind of thing, they pick like one book for each year, but I cannot do that. I just can't seem to limit myself like that. I just have way too many favorites to pick just one, and you can see throughout the years how my reading tastes have changed. So these are my most iconic books that were published in each year of my life. Obviously, I did not read a lot of these when they were published. I did not read historical romances when I was 3 years old, okay? But let's just jump into it. If we share any favorites from any specific years, please let me know. So starting off with 1996, the year that I was born, I chose two favorites for this year, and one of them, yes, is a historical romance. It is one of my all-time favorite historical romances. It is iconic in and of itself. It is Indigo by Beverly Jenkins. It was my very first Beverly Jenkins book and it's still my top favorite from her. It is such a beautiful historical romance. I fell in love with it. It's got the caretaker trope, you know, the hero gets sick. It is such a wonderful read. You get lost in the history and the romance, and you can't not fall in love with the hero who absolutely adores and cherishes his heroine. The other 1996 book that I chose was Kiss an Angel by Susan Elizabeth Phillips, and the reason that I chose this book was because I am pretty sure this was the book that blooded me for groveling romances, and it's a book that I've reread countless times. I mean, I've mainly just reread the groveling part, but I freaking love this book so much. It's such a weird romance. It's actually about a circus. The main characters enter this arranged marriage very reluctantly, and the hero wants nothing to do with her, so he takes her back to where he works, which is at a circus, and then something major happens that leads to some intense angst. Oh my god, every time I reread this one, my heart hurts so good. It's great. It's definitely one of the very first groveling romances that made an impression on me, so I have to include it in my 1996 list. And then for 1997, I only have one book here, surprisingly, but it is a book that made a humongous impact, and I'm sure that a bunch of other people would also put this book in their 1997 column. It's the first Harry Potter, Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone by J.K. Rowling. There's no denying that Harry Potter, like the whole series, the whole franchise, has changed a lot of people's lives. Obviously, I did not read this when it came out. I was a 1-year-old, but I read it pretty early on, like in elementary school, and it's one of the earliest books I can remember falling in love with and making me want to read more books. And then for 1998, there is a book that came out from one of my all-time favorite historical romance authors in 1998, and it is Stranger in My Arms by Lisa Kleypas. It's got such a unique premise. I mean, the heroine is married, but she does not really like her husband, so when he ends up dying out at sea, she is pretty relieved about it. But then it turns out he actually was not dead because he shows up alive, except that he is very different from how he was before. And this time around, this husband and wife have some insane chemistry that they've never had before. If you love like a darkish, broodyish hero who is kind of obsessed with the heroine, you will fall in love with this book. I mean, it hit all the right buttons for me. And then moving on to 1999, the last of the 90s, I picked two books here, a children's book and a romance, two very different reads. The children's book I read as a kid. I fell in love with the series. It's the first book in the series of Unfortunate Events by Lemony Snicket. It's called The Bad Beginning. I can't say that I remember the actual plot of it besides the main characters, the kids, being orphans and being taken to this not so great guy's house to live in, and I think he wanted to kill them to get their inheritance. So pretty intense for a children's book, but still, I did love the series. I read a bunch of the books. I never finished it though, but I do remember being a huge fan of it. And then the 1996 romance that I have is actually one of the very first romances that I've ever read. It is a historical romance, but the reason why I read it, the reason why I picked it up was more for the paranormal aspect. It's Beyond the Highland Mist by Karen Marie Moning. So the way I discovered romances was that I went from children's books to YA to fantasy. I went from young adult fantasy to adult fantasy. Like, I read a bunch of urban fantasy books, and one of the authors that I loved was Karen Marie Moning. I loved her Fever series, but when I finished that, when I caught up on that series, I wanted to read more from her, so I picked up the first book in her historical romance series, and I was so into it. I definitely went on a Highlander binge after I read this one. Before I dive into the rest of this video, I want to give a quick shout out to today's sponsor, which is The Paris Roommates by Ava Miles. This book is like Emily in Paris Meets Friends. It's this humorous and heartfelt novel about a good girl baker named Thea Rogers. It's been 10 years since Thea had this magical year in a work-study program at a restaurant in Paris, but once this program ended, instead of going on to have her own shop back in the US, Thea is an overworked, unpaid baker living her life through Netflix. Then when the owner of a Parisian restaurant falls ill, Thea and her former roommates are pulled back to Paris. They go back to where it all began to help her friend and her troubled restaurant to get back on their feet. There's a romance with a gorgeous French lawyer, but just when Thea is starting to fall in love, she gets offered her true dream of running a bakery back in small town USA. So will she choose to chase her bakery dreams or stay with her found family and the man that she's fallen in love with? You can find out and meet Thea and her friends by grabbing a copy of The Paris Roommates by Ava Miles. I'll leave a link to it down below. A big thank you to Ava Miles for being today's sponsor, and back to the rest of this video. For 2000, this was a year of Meg Cabot. Meg Cabot was my girl back in the day. She is how I discovered YA and YA romance. But in 2000, she came out with two bops: The Princess Diaries, the very first Princess Diaries, and the first book in the Mediator series, which is Shadowland. Even though the Mediator series is my top favorite series of Meg Cabot, The Princess Diaries was the first series that I read from her. It's just that the impact that Meg Cabot had on me as a reader, I cannot thank her enough for writing all these amazing stories, amazing romances with these book boyfriends that I fell in love with at 12 years old. Jesse was perfection to me back in the day, okay? I love both series though. They are both so iconic to me. And then for 2001, I went with the book Flipped. It's by an author that I never bothered to learn the name of, so I actually had to look it up, look up who this author was, and it's Wendelin Van Dranen. Or Dranen. This story is the definition of unrequited love, because the whole story is about a girl who is in unrequited love with her neighbor slash classmate. He couldn't really care less about her, but they slowly do eventually become friends. And then at the end of the book, spoilers for those who have not read it, things flip between them. She falls out of love with him and he falls in unrequited love with her. So this ending was simultaneously satisfying and unsatisfying, because obviously there's no happily ever after. They're still kids, so it's fine. But it was just the way that this twist played out. It got to me. And then for 2002, I have to go with a Sarah Dessen book because she was also one of my authors back in the day. Her 2002 book that I loved was This Lullaby. I will admit I barely remember anything about it. I think the hero was some sort of musician. Like, music was definitely a big part of this book. Even though I can't remember that much, it is one of my favorites from Sarah Dessen. It's not my top favorite though. I'll talk about my top favorite in a bit. But for this year, I just went with This Lullaby because I couldn't really find anything else, and I do love Sarah Dessen. And then for 2003, I have a YA book by one of my all-time favorite authors. It is Saving Francesca by Melina Marchetta. Melina Marchetta was one of those authors for me as a teen where I could really appreciate beautiful writing. Every single one of her stories was so freaking emotional and just got to me, but Saving Francesca was the first book that I ever read from her and I just instantly fell in love. Saving Francesca was one of her high school books, her high school romances, where the heroine was dealing with depression. I just loved her books though, and of course I fell in love with her romances. For 2004, I have my favorite Sarah Dessen book and another Lisa Kleypas book. My favorite Sarah Dessen book is The Truth About off forever, and I love this one because I friggin' love the romance in it. It's about a girl who's in high school, and for the summer she gets this job at a catering company, and there's this great cast of characters, and the hero is this artistic bad boy that you fall in love with so hard. I think Wes had a tattoo too, and I definitely fell in love with tattooed bad boys here. And it's so heartfelt and emotional and so swoony. Okay, I'm editing this video right now, and for some reason I skipped over the Lisa Kleypas book that came out in 2004. Why, I don't know, but obviously I have to talk about one of my all-time favorite Lisa Kleypas books, Again the Magic. This is her one second chance historical romance, and of course it was angst heaven. It was so heart-wrenching. The romance is heartbreaking and emotional and so beautiful, and this hero, McKenna, oh my goodness, I love him to death. He just wrecked me when I read this book. So yes, I have to include Again the Magic for 2004. And then for 2005, I have 3 very iconic books. 2 of them are vampire books, and you can probably guess what they are, but I will start off with the non-vampire book. It's The Lightning Thief by Rick Riordan, the very first Percy Jackson book. I was that girl who fell in love with mythology, learned all about mythology because of this series. This series was fantastic. I had never read anything like it before, and it was just so much fun. And then for the vampire books that came out in 2005, obviously the biggest one was Twilight by Stephanie Meyer. I did not hop on the Twilight train until like a year or 2 after it came out. I instantly fell in love with it. I was absolutely a Twilight fangirl. I was Team Edward all the way, and honestly to this day I still love it. I haven't read it in a very long time, but I have no shame in saying that I love Twilight. And then the other vampire book that also came out in 2005 was Dark Lover by J.R. Ward. J.R. Ward came out with the first Black Dagger Brotherhood book this year, and it's one of my favorites. J.R. Ward was one of my first romance authors that I'd ever read or discovered, because after I read Karen Marie Moning, I wanted some more paranormal romances, and J.R. Ward was the big one at the time. So I read Dark Lover, fell in love with it, and just inhaled the rest of the Black Dagger Brotherhood series. Book 2 is my favorite of the series, but Dark Lover will always have a special place in my heart just because it's the first one. And then for 2006, we are getting into some good years now, like 2005 and on. Some good books. First off, one of my most iconic books is I'd Tell You I Love You, But Then I'd Have to Kill You by Ally Carter, the first book in her Gallagher Girls series. I was obsessed with that series as a teen. It's a spy series, a spy girl series. There's this amazing romance. I remember dying for each new release when they came out, and I was just so in love with the world, with these characters. It was so good, okay? I mean, it was all about spies, and it was just so cool to read. And then another one of my all-time favorite books that had me sobbing, I mean, it's a World War II book. It's The Book Thief by Marcus Zusak. And it's another one of those books where I was just in awe of the writing. The writing was beautiful and impactful, and the story itself was intense, and the ending had me crying. Again, it's a World War II book, but it's also got such an interesting twist to it. And then the last of my 2006 favorites is Slave to Sensation by Nalini Singh. Nalini is one of my absolute top favorite authors, and this was a book that made me fall in love with her. Slave to Sensation is the first book in the Side Changeling series, which is one of my favorites. It's a paranormal romance series that is so good. The premise of it is super unique and interesting. The romances are incredible. Each book just sucks you in even more. Moving on to 2007, I have 2 very popular YA books, 2 popular YA series that started this year. First is City of Bones by Cassandra Clare. I was obsessed with the Mortal Instruments series. I was just a huge fan of this world. I was so obsessed that I would basically check the author's blog or Tumblr every single day for any new updates. So yes, I was a big fan of the Mortal Instruments. I was also a huge fan of the Infernal Devices, and it's one of my absolute favorites when it comes to YA fantasy. Another classic YA series that came out this year is Vampire Academy. Rochelle Mead came out with Vampire Academy this year, and like I said, It's iconic. I loved the heck out of the series. I love the romance especially too. Oh my gosh, this series was a roller coaster when it came to like all the different twists, the action, the plot, the romance. The series had me in a chokehold, and Dimitri is still my man. I want to say I love age gap romances because of this series. I mean, a girl falling in love with her hot older instructor, come on. Dimitri and Rose are just so perfect together. And then for 2008, this was a year I think that I really started getting into YA. First up, one of my all-time favorites that came out this year is Graceling by Kristen Cashore. This book is a classic when it comes to YA fantasy. I love it so much. And yes, I fell in love with the romance here. Clearly, I was a romance reader in the making, but this fantasy world was so good. I love this one so much. It made me fall in love with Kristen Cashore. I adore the series too. Another book that came out this year that I was obsessed with was The Host by Stephanie Meyer. We all know Twilight was the hit, but The Host was amazing too. I loved this sci-fi romance so much. It's definitely like the first alien romance that I'd ever read, so I guess I could say I love alien romances because of this book. The amount of times that I reread this was insane. It was just so unique and fascinating, and I loved the enemies to lovers romance here. I mean, it was mostly the hero hating the heroine, but then he becomes like a total simp for her. But yeah, I don't think anyone ever expected or thought that this alien romance from Stephanie Meyer would be good, but it was amazing. And then 2009 had some good hits too. First off, The Summer I Turned Pretty by Jenny Han. The summer series is Jenny Han top tier. It was love triangle perfection. I was like Team Conrad book 1, Team Jeremiah book 2, and then Team Conrad book 3. The amount of angst in this series was so well done, and I remember reading it with my best friend back in middle school, and we were like, we're gonna own a summer house and we're gonna have kids and make our kids fall in love with each other, just like in this series. Another iconic YA paranormal romance for me was Shiver by Maggie Stiefvater. I was obsessed with this series. Oh my goodness. I fell in love with wolves and wolf shifters. It was just so good. I mean, from what I can remember, I think the hero was just completely in love with the heroine, so obviously I loved it. He was like borderline obsessed and stalkerish, right? And now here I am in love with obsessed and stalker heroes in my romances. And then we have 2010, and I am deep into my YA phase. One of my absolute favorites from this year is The Iron King by Julie Kagawa. The Iron Phase series was another one of my top favorite series back in the day. I love this world, I love the characters, I love the romance. It was one of the OG Fae romances, and the enemies to lovers romance here was so good. The other YA romance that I fell in love with this year was Anna and the French Kiss by Stephanie Perkins. This book was a hit, and I 100% wanted my own French boyfriend here. This book was top tier friends to lovers, okay? It was also super messy because the main characters wanted each other, but he had a girlfriend, so they settled as friends at first, and it was still so swoony. And also the whole setting of France, of Paris, that was fantastic. It is a classic in YA contemporary romance. And then in 2011, 3 all-time favorites came out this year. Shadow Fever by Karen Marie Moning. Yes, I have another Karen Marie Moning book here, but that's because I love her and her books. It's the 5th book, and at the time it was the final book in the Fever series, but this book blew my socks off. First off, the series is amazing. It's urban fantasy with a good romance. It was everything that I wanted in a finale for an epic fantasy series. And also, Barron's is still one of my all-time favorite book boyfriends ever. And then I have 2 YA books that came out this year that I am still in love with. First off is Angel Fall by Susan E. This is an angel romance, and it's also dystopian, like post-apocalyptic. It was a pretty dark series actually, especially for YA. Like a lot of intense things happened, but it was incredible. I think it was the author's debut, but the writing was fantastic. I love the world building here, and the romance, the romance hurt so good. There were so many ups and downs for these 2 characters, but it was all worth it by the end. And then the final book that I picked for 2011 was Shatter Me by Tahira Mafi. This book and this series was also one of my favorites. It was another kind of series where the heroine does not end up with the guy that she chooses in the first book. So yes, I am a Warner fangirl. If you can make me fall in love with a bad guy who I did not like in the beginning of the series, then I will love you forever for it. And then 2012 was the year that I really started getting into romances. Like, I hadn't quit YA just yet, but I was definitely falling more in love with romance books, and this is a year that you can definitely see a shift in terms of my reading tastes. 2012 and 2013 were both really good years, and I could not narrow these 2 years down, so I have a lot of books for them. 2012, I have to include Slammed and Hopeless by Colleen Hoover. Okay, I was a Coho fangirl back in high school. I was obsessed with all of her books, and I still stand by in thinking that her earlier works are a lot better than her newer stuff. I just loved how funny and enjoyable her books were, even though a bunch of them dealt with some more serious topics like Hopeless. And then another book that I fell in love with that year that was like in a similar vein was The Sea of Tranquility by Katia Mille. This book was a one-hit wonder for this author because she never released anything after it. It was new adult, like high school new adult, also had some intense topics, but the writing was fantastic and I loved the main characters. I still do think about this book and this author every once in a while, but mostly because I really wish that she wrote more stuff. I mean, it's possible she did, just under a different pen name. And then a YA book that I loved this year was a debut, Pushing the Limits by Katie McGarry. This was YA, but more mature YA. It also had some darker themes to it too. I don't know why. This year came out with contemporaries with some heavy topics, but I instantly became the biggest fan of Katie McGarry with this book. I fell in love with the rest of the Pushing the Limits series, but this one is still my favorite. Also, it's got the classic bad boy hero here that I absolutely fell in love with. And then the final 2012 book that I picked that also had such an impact on me was a more adult book. It was Bare to You by Sylvia Day. It's the first book in the Crossfire series, and I still love this series to this day. I reread it every once in a while. I just loved this obsessed billionaire hero. Gideon is still one of my favorites, but the heroine was fantastic as well. And then, like I said, 2013 had some fantastic books too. I'll start off with the final YA book I have to talk about. 2013 was truly the end of an era for me, but I had to pick Clockwork Princess by Cassandra Clare as my final YA, mostly because this book had me in a wreck. I sobbed my eyes out at the end of this book because it was the final book in the Infernal Devices series, and I just did not want to let the series or these characters go. I loved it so much, but I sobbed like 3 separate times at the end of this book. If you know me, you know I don't really cry for books that much, so if you can make me cry, it's a good book. And then I had to pick the Penelope Douglas debut. I had to pick Bully because this book was my life. I don't even like bully romances, but this one is iconic and definitely one of the classics in new adult romance. I absolutely fell in love with Jared. He is forever gonna be one of my top favorites from Penelope Douglas. Also, I know I'm talking about the heroes all the time, but I do love the heroines too, okay? Tate was fantastic. What I loved about her character and what made me fall for this book so much was the way she was able to stand up for herself. So these two were a match made in heaven, and I will never forget this book, especially since it put Penelope Douglas on my radar, and I have loved every single book that they have written since. Another forever favorite, one that I have reread a million times, is Heart of Obsidian by Nalini Singh. Heart of Obsidian is my top favorite in the Side Changeling series and the whole Side Changeling world. It is the ultimate paranormal romance. It is so unbelievably good. I do think this one is a general fan favorite, and I mean, It's obvious to see why once you read it. It's another one of those villain gets his own romance type of stories, and it is so worth the wait because it's book 12 in the series. Another classic noodle romance for me is Addicted to You by Kristen Becca Ritchie. This book and this whole series, the whole Addicted series, will forever have me in a chokehold. Like the way these books were written, the way that you fall so hard for every single one of these characters. These core 6 characters were brought to life in a way that I don't really experience that often. And even though Addicted to You is not my top favorite in this series, it is still the one that started it all, so I have to include it. I will talk about my top favorite though in the next year. And then if that wasn't enough, I do have one more 2013 book, which is Beautiful Player by Christina Lauren. This one is still, to this day, my favorite Christina Lauren book. Nothing will ever top Will and Hannah. This book is Friends to Lovers perfection. Friends to Lovers is one of my favorite tropes, and this one just cements why I love it so much. It's also hilarious. There's so many good one-liners. The banter is chef's kiss, and it just gives me the warm and fuzzy feels every time I reread it. And then for 2014, my 2 top favorites. Well, first off, the first one has to be Kiss the Sky by Kristen Becca Ritchie because of Connor Cobalt and Rose Calloway. They are the definition of power couple. I am still as obsessed with them as I was back in 2014. This book is my top favorite of the entire Addicted series. It's my favorite from Kristen Becca Ritchie. Just have so much love for this book, for these 2 characters, the way that they lift each other up all the time, the way that they speak French to each other. This book is just incredible with 2 unforgettable iconic characters. And then the other 2014 book is Burn for Me by Ilona Andrews. I love Ilona Andrews in general, and I honestly could have chosen like any Kate Daniels book, but I chose Burn for Me because 1, I reread it so many times, 2, I love Mad Rogan. There's just something about Hidden Legacy, like the whole world building, it is so fascinating, and the slow burn is so good when the most powerful man in the entire world falls for you and wants you. That is such a heady feeling. And then for 2015, this was a good year for me. I had so many favorites, but my top 3: Corrupt by Penelope Douglas. You will definitely be seeing plenty of Penelope Douglas in this video, but Corrupt was the start of a new series where Penelope Douglas really went more on the dark side, and it really paid off. I love the whole Devil's Night series, but Rika and Michael being the first ones is just I still love them so much. And then there's The Master by Kresley Cole. This is another one of my favorite books to reread. It's a weird book to think about. It's about a heroine who is on the run from a dangerous man. She becomes an escort and is hired by the billionaire hero who has some mafia ties. She's hired for one night and he doesn't let her go. He becomes obsessed with her. But that's the wonderful thing about Kresley Cole, just her alpha obsessed heroes. So this book was just heaven for me. But the most important and the most iconic book of 2015 for me was Kulti by Mariana Zapata. If someone asks me what's my favorite romance book, I will pick Kulti just because it has my whole heart. It is Friends to Lovers slow burn perfection. I have never been so consumed by such a long book where every single scene was just so wonderful and special and vital to the romance. I have also reread this one a million times. Like if I love a book, I will reread it forever. It is just absolute perfection for me, and it's also the first Mariana book that I ever read. For 2016, I have to include another Mariana Zapata book. This one is The Wall of Winnipeg and Me. I mean, yes, it was tough to follow up with Kulti, but when she came out with this football romance, I was like, yes, this is why I love her so much. It is Marriage of Convenience with the perfect grumpy hero. Like when I think of a grumpy hero, I think of Aiden. This one is just iconic when it comes to Marriage of Convenience and football romances. And then I had to pick A Court of Mist and Fury by Sarah J Maas. This is my absolute favorite of all the ACOTAR books. There were just so many things in this book that completely changed the game for the series, and it all worked out perfectly. Anyway, this one's the best and still my favorite SJM book. And then another all-time favorite of mine is Wolf Song by TJ Klune. I fell in love with TJ Klune's writing with this book. I remember reading this book and just knowing how special his writing and his storytelling was, and I was right, because every single book that I've read from him I have fallen so hard for. This one is an wolf shifter romance, but it's also unlike any other wolf shifter romance that I've read. It's very family oriented. TJ Klune is the king of found family. It's the first book in the Green Creek series, which is phenomenal and will have you wrecked by the end of it. And of course, I forgot to add another book for 2016. This one is the Mindfuck series by St. Abbey. I only read it this year in 2023, but it blew my mind. It's a dark romance about a serial killer heroine and an FBI agent hero who is trying to hunt her down. It was epic and intense and gritty, and it's such an unforgettable story. It's absolutely one of my favorites that came out this year. And then 2017, I have two all-time favorites by two very important authors to me. First up, Queen Lisa Kleypas. I loved Devil in Spring. I know this comes to a surprise to many, but I kind of love Devil in Spring more than Devil in Winter. This one just spoke to me more. Like, I can definitely see and understand why Devil in Winter is the one for a lot of Lisa Kleypas fans, but Devil in Spring was just so special and so wonderful for me, and that was 100% because of the heroine here. Pandora is one of my absolute favorite heroines that I've ever read. And then there's also a hero who is like, I want you to spread your wings and fly, but I also want to be by your side while you do that. So this romance was just so perfect for me. And then my other iconic 2017 book is Still by Kennedy Ryan. This book is still my favorite Kennedy Ryan book. This one holds a special place in my heart, mostly because it had me crying tears of joy. It was so beautiful. I just have so much love for this book, for Grip and Bristol here. I will never forget their story. And then 2018 was also another great year. I had to pick another Kennedy Ryan book because I just have so many favorites from her, but this one is Blockshot. This one is a bit controversial. It's like either people love it or people hate it, and that's because the heroine has a boyfriend, but the hero does not care. And that aspect of Jared is why I loved him so much. That single-minded focus and determination to be with the heroine is what I love to read, okay? That's my kryptonite. Also, Banner and Jared are another power couple that I am obsessed with. These two are at the top of their industry as sports agents. They are killing it, and together they are just fire. I have another Penelope Douglas favorite here this year as well. This one is Birthday Girl. When you think of ex-boyfriend's dad romance, the first book that you would think of is Birthday Girl. It's cemented itself as the ex-boyfriend's dad romance, and for good reason, because this book is so good. I also have another Christina Lauren book here. This is the one that wrecked me the most. It's Love in Other Words. I remember when this one came out, they said that this book was going to be very different from their earlier books, and while it is, it's also one of the most romantic books from them. It's childhood friends to lovers. Obviously, if you could not tell, I love Friends to Lovers. When it's done well, it is so perfect. Love in Other Words had my heart hurting like crazy. It's messy, it's angsty, it's romantic. We have a hero who has always been in love with a heroine, even when they've been separated for decades. I mean, how can I not love that? And then for 2019, I have The Bride Test by Helen Huang. I adored the heck out of this book. Kai and Esme were so wonderful, so beautiful together, and it was one of the few books where I felt so seen as an Asian American. This book is so precious to me, and I just love Helen Huang in general. Next, I know you're probably tired of seeing Penelope Douglas, but I do have another one because Kill Switch came out in 2019, and I can't not include Damon's book. When you can write a good villain, then set up his book, and when you get to him, it's everything that you ever wanted. I'm gonna love it, okay? Kill Switch is without a doubt my favorite of the series. You go through all the emotions here. You're like, how on earth can I possibly fall in love with Damon? And then you do. Penelope Douglas did wreck me with this one. Another 2019 hit for me was Bitter Heat by Mia Knight. This book I have reread an unbelievable amount of times. It's second chance romance perfection for me because not only do we have an obsessed hero who is pretty much a psychopath. We have a heroine who moved on in the best of ways when they got divorced. I absolutely hate when heroines remain celibate after a separation. I just don't understand why authors love to write this, but we get none of that in Bitter Heat. The heroine lives her life to the fullest after leaving the hero after he says some awful things. But now they reunite and this hero is not gonna let anything stop him from having her again. And then moving on to the 2020s, we are almost done with this video. First off is Sea of Ruin by Pam Godwin. This book was something special. I loved Pam Godwin before this, but this was her very first historical romance, but she absolutely nailed everything about it. It was the perfect blend of dark and historical romance, and it's got pirates. It's got a little twist to the romance that I personally did not see coming, but I could not be more happy about. And then Beach Read by Emily Henry came out this year, and I fell instantly in love with this author because of it. The writing was phenomenal. Emily Henry makes you want to laugh and cry in the same page. I just loved everything about this one, and it's always so nice and wonderful to discover a new favorite author when you read one of their books for the first time. That was Emily Henry for me. And then I do also have to include Credence by Penelope Douglas. Every time I read a book of theirs, it just blows me away. And Credence was just so far out there and removed from anything else that they had ever written that I was mind-boggled by it. But it worked. It somehow worked. And then in 2021, Real by Kennedy Ryan was one of my top favorite reads. Every time I read a Kennedy Ryan book, I fall in love with her writing all over again. Her writing, her storytelling, the way that she weaves all this emotion into her stories is phenomenal. Real is one of my favorites from her. It's about this movie where the heroine gets cast as the lead and the hero is its director. And then my other favorite of 2021 was The Love Hypothesis by Ali Hazelwood. It's made itself an icon in the fake dating trope, and also Adam pushing a car with his bare muscles will always live in my head rent-free. So yes, I do love this book, and it was a very special debut. Moving on to 2022, my top 2 favorites of last year. Oh my goodness. So first one is King of Wrath by Anna Huang. I loved the heck out of this one. It's enemies to lovers, arranged marriage, perfection. It was just everything that I wanted in these tropes. I loved the main characters so much, and I'm never not gonna complain about some good groveling at the end of a book. King of Wrath is the first book in the Kings of Sin series, and as soon as I read this one, I was like, I knew that the series was going to be a top favorite for me. And then my other favorite for 2022 was Things We Never Got Over by Lucy Score. This was another book that I had blown up like crazy, and I was wondering what was so special about it. And then as soon as I read it, I was like, okay, I now understand why. It was my very first Lucy Score book. I fell in love with her sense of humor. I loved the little small town that it's set in. And of course, I loved the grumpy sunshine romance in it. And then finally, we have 2023. Even though the year is not over yet, I do have 2 favorites that I can at least talk about. First up is In the Lives of Puppets by TJ Klune. This is his latest fantasy romance, and it's about robots, and it was one of the most heartwarming and endearing books that I had ever read. He brought these robot characters to life, and I could not love them more. It's also freaking hilarious. And then the final book in this video, another top favorite of this year so far, is Liars Like Us by JT Geisinger. This was another funny book that had me cracking up, and what's interesting about it is that it's a sort of dark romance. We have a psychopath obsessed hero who will do anything to have the heroine, but the way that this was written was so over the top and so entertaining. It definitely won't work for everyone, but it worked 100% for me. And I also love when authors can write their characters so well where you don't even need their point of view, but you can just tell what they're feeling, you can understand what they're going through. That was how this hero came across. We don't get his point of view, we only have the heroine's point of view, but we just knew everything about how obsessed he was with the heroine without reading a single thought from him. I love this book so hard. It is ridiculous, but It's also everything that I want in an obsessed billionaire romance. And that's it for all of my top favorite books that were published in each year of my life. I definitely made this video longer than it needed to be, but it was so hard to narrow these books down. But now you probably have a good understanding of who I am as a person based off of my favorite books. Let me know if we share any of the same favorites. I would love to hear your thoughts on them. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you all next time. Bye!